Jack the Ripper is a name known by virtually everyone, the most infamous serial killer in history. He's no stranger to the gaming world, having appeared in multiple games bearing his name, and most recently turning up in the DLC for Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Given this, it seems almost inevitable that after investigating the worlds of H.P. Lovecraft and Maurice LeBlanc in the previous two installments, Frogwares would decide to bring Holmes into the real world with their next release to confront him. It's far from the first time the pair have encountered each other. The Victorian time period makes them a natural for people to put together, and it's been done many times, perhaps most famously in the 1979 film Murder by Decree.
You squashed my pee.
Compared to the previous games, the tone this time is necessarily darker. Where The Awakened was happy to lean on the campier side of supernatural horror, and Nemesis went all out with the comedy, neither of those would be fitting for a game based on a real killer. Gone are the bright streets with children playing, replaced with the grim, dirty streets of Victorian-era Whitechapel. Though occasionally the foreboding atmosphere is undermined a little when some of the characters open their mouths.
Out of the way, I don't like the look of you!
The game begins with Sherlock in one of his characteristic depressions, before Watson berates him about why he should care about the murders.
No less than any other, she was a human, and one of Her Majesty's subjects.
Holmes immediately leaps into action, and once the great detective is on the case, nothing would ever distract him.
I'd have to find out if it's really perfume.
Madam, I will undertake to tell you exactly which of these products are perfumes, if you agree to entrust them to me for a little while.
Well, unless a brothel madam needs perfume identifying, I guess. I mean, you have to prioritise. Despite moments like this, Sherlock Holmes vs. Jack the Ripper is a far more focused affair than the previous games, taking place almost entirely in the Whitechapel region, which you'll become very familiar with before the game is over. It's quite a large area to explore though, and they've done a much better job than the earlier games of making it feel populated. The place is teeming with people wandering around, and they don't feel copy and pasted quite as regularly as in the earlier games.
There's a bloke behind that door there. No pity Bluto.
Will have something to tell me in the morning.
Watson and Holmes spend much of the game between Whitechapel and Baker Street investigating and following up leads on various suspects, most of them real people who have been suspects at one time or another in the real case, such as the obnoxious but amusingly named Dr. Tumblety.
As it happens, I do have a collection of female genital organs, which I hold dear.
Yeah, no idea why they ever suspected that guy. The game has been quite thoroughly researched, which is both one of the main strengths and weaknesses. A lot of the things in the game are accurate, but it also means that anyone with any degree of knowledge of the Ripper case is going to find much of the game quite familiar. Though maybe not everything.
But what's all this racket? Calm down, come on, out, and make those chaps shut up.
This is also the game where Sherlock finally snaps. Tired of being terrified by Watson's teleporting abilities in the previous games, the detective turns criminal and murders his partner. Okay, maybe he's actually just reenacting the crime for research purposes. This time round they programmed some proper pathfinding AI, fixing the creepy Watson of the last two releases. He now follows you around properly rather than only moving when you're not looking like some sort of weeping angel. Frogwares then went back and re-released the previous games in remastered form with this improvement, along with the game's other new features, such as the option to play in a more traditional third-person point-and-click style, and a hotspot highlighter. They are very worthwhile features to include, though I once again stuck to the first-person view. Obviously a key part of investigating the Jack the Ripper case would be the bodies of the victims, and Sherlock vs. Jack handles this with more sensitivity than you might expect from a medium that often revels in gory imagery. Holmes doesn't want to get openly involved in the case, and so doesn't view the bodies themselves, instead relying on reports of them, which are then represented as two-dimensional drawings. It's a nice touch considering that however long ago the murders may have been, the victims in this game were real people. The main bulk of the puzzles consist of the actual investigation elements, and this game does a good job of making these feel part of the case. You will piece together clues to make deductions, test out blades to determine which ones could have been used by the killer, compare witness statements on a timeline, and various other tasks relating to identifying who Jack the Ripper actually was.
Find me 3 mannequins, my worker's costume, my 3 full wigs, one of your worn garments, yes, that can be used for the workman's outfit, and one of your old suits. Oh, and my deerstalker, the one I never wear, but everyone seems to think I wear day and night.
If there's any problem with these, it's that the difficulty has swung a little too far the other way compared to Nemesis. While the previous game could be incredibly difficult at times, much of Jack the Ripper is almost trivially easy. Rather than just letting you get on and try and work things out yourself, you're basically told what to do. Instead of being Holmes, you're simply following his instructions.
Let's add Miss Long's meeting with the victim at 2 minutes before 5:30 a.m.
Okay, I see.
Mr. Kadosh claims to have passed by the Spitalfields Church at 5:32, which given the distance from 27 Hanbury Street would mean he was still at home at 5:31. Let's therefore put the end of his testimony at 5:31.
Yep, I've got it. I'll work it out myself now.
Miss Long heard the man say to the victim, "Will you?" To which the victim responded, "Yes," which would suggest that an agreement was reached and that the transaction was imminent. They then proceeded to enter the garden, which puts the voices heard by Kadosh at 5:29.
Will you please just shut up a moment, Holmes?
Now then, taking into account that the local clock isn't exact...
Oh, will you just Anyway, aside from the investigations, there's a few more traditional inventory puzzles, along with some logic puzzles that are mostly decent but don't always fit all that well into the plot. Why would anyone ever lock their valuables away behind a puzzle that anyone who comes along can solve with a bit of thought? How can we lock away these incriminating documents? I know, behind a symbol matching game. Who could ever crack that? And while most of the game is very easy, the game does suddenly throw one ridiculous puzzle at you that's odd for all the wrong reasons. Tumblety's chest is locked with a puzzle involving the American Civil War, where you have to match up battles with their dates, flags and uniforms. Very little of this information is provided anywhere in the game. A simple in-game reference book from the bookshop would have saved the puzzle, but as it is, unless you've got really in-depth knowledge of US military history, this is going to involve either a lot of tedious trial and error, or some in-depth, out-of-game Googling. It's an utterly bizarre concept for a puzzle and one of the worst I've played in a long time. Apart from that one though, I generally enjoyed the puzzles in this game, even the ones that felt quite tangential to the main plot. And while the investigations might have been straightforward, they did make me feel involved with the case.
This line of investigation is far too vague.
I heard that the two of you made your way to Whitechapel a few days ago.
The voice acting in the game isn't amazing, but it is tolerable, though it does have the occasional instances where people seem to have been reading their lines without context, so the delivery feels odd.
Goodbye, my friend.
Oi, that's it.
And it's one of those works where the subtitles appear to be from a different translation of the original to the script the actors were using, meaning they don't always quite match up.
Huh? I say, Holmes?
Is he always such a skinflint with you, Mr. Holmes? Well, thanks to you, Mr. Holmes. Anytime you need me.
This is especially noticeable in a scene where the brothel madam refers to buying jewellery on the black market, but the subtitles refer to something quite different.
They bought some jewellery on the black market, I think.
That's really not the same thing, Frogwares. There are a few other flaws, though they're mostly fairly minor. As thoroughly as they researched the case, they then managed to slip up with some basic anachronisms, such as someone being prescribed penicillin for syphilis about 40 years before it was discovered. And there's this electric lift before any were ever introduced in the UK really, that seems to have been put in there just so they could have an electrical circuit puzzle. Then there's a point where I had to find out a way to straighten a bent key, which brought me to a halt for a couple of minutes while trying to figure out what to do, because the game wanted me to close the vice first before putting the key in, which doesn't make any sense at all. Am I supposed to be jamming the key in between the already closed blocks? Sherlock Holmes vs. Jack the Ripper is ultimately quite an improvement over the earlier games in most ways, and possibly the best in the series to this point, though which game you like best may well be determined by your preferred storytelling style, given the wildly varying tones between the games. This one does wrap up in a more satisfying way than the earlier games, although suggesting one of the real people suspected in the case as being the real killer is questionable when the genuine identity isn't known. But it's better than the cop-out endings from the last couple of entries in the series, and actually seemed fairly convincing. The next time he returned to the gaming screen, Frogwares would finally abandon the literary and real-world crossovers and instead write a very different Sherlock Holmes story. But for now, it's time to wrap up this case.
And, oh yes, it is understood that you cannot chronicle this investigation. It would be best to invent a story that takes us far from London during the sombre period, in pursuit of, let's see, something challenging. A ghostly dog that glows in the night.
Don't be ridiculous, Holmes.